Okay, welcome to week 8 for the course. And so this week we're going to be talking about authenticity and learner perceptions and how this actually kind of relates to motivation. Okay, so just a few things before we get started. So mid-semester evaluation. So I've posted something on the course website. It's labeled, I think, as mid-semester evaluations or mid-semester something or other. And basically it's a survey for you to fill out, so you can provide feedback and give suggestions. It's completely anonymous, so I won't know what you're saying, or what I won't be able to link anything back to a specific individual. So if you can fill that out, it'd be really helpful, just so I can know, get an idea of what to change. I can't promise I'll be able to change everything that you have suggestions for, but if you have suggestions right now, some of them I might be able to fix for the rest of the semester, and then some of them might be helpful for when I teach a course like this in the future. Okay, so please take the time to do that. Oops. And so getting into the main thing today, so authenticity. So it's kind of a complicated topic, and it kind of dates back to like the turn of movements kind of in language learning. So prior to like this push for authenticity, we had this idea like called the cult of materials. And so a lot of you who have taken 302 like will remember that we've talked about like the audiolingual period, and how you have things like crazy English and whatnot. And so like you have like these tapes that tell you what to say, and the tapes kind of tell you like the materials themselves are kind of what's controlling the learning. Okay, so and so what happens is when we have this push from the audiolingual period to this more communicative approach to teaching, there's a kind of a renewed push for authenticity in materials. And so what happens is, rather than having these materials that are like set in stone and kind of contrived to help the learner proceed, we have this push for materials that are more real in nature. Okay. The problem is when we talk about authenticity, we don't really know how to define it. So it's ambiguous in nature. There are a lot of different ways that you can interpret this. And there's a lot of problems when we really start to break it down. So basically, so looking at the Gilmore article, you kind of see like she lists out these different things that like that authenticity actually refers to. So it talks about like so it refers to language by the native speaker for native speakers. So anybody who's a native speaker, like writing letters for other native speakers, or news programs or things like that, those would be considered authentic. Language by real speakers or writers for the real audience. Qualities given to the text by the receiver. Interaction between students and teachers. Pretty self-explanatory. So the types of checks and tasks chosen. So some tasks are going to be considered more authentic than others. Social situation of the classroom. So what's going on in the classroom exactly, and how this. So does the material that's actually being introduced relate to that social situation? What types of social situations are there? What types of interactions do students have to make, and is it realistic in nature? Assessment. So whether or not assessments actually tell you whether or not the person can actually use these concepts in a useful way. So beyond the classroom, and then culture and the ability to behave or think like a target language group. Okay, so you want to look at the role that culture plays in language development as well. Okay, so so when we think about authenticity, then we've generally come to like this one conclusion. Okay, so authenticity is centered on the text, participants, social and cultural situation, the purposes of the communicative act, or a combination of all of these things. So authenticity is actually it's like an umbrella term in a sense. So it takes all of these different factors and brings them together, which makes for a lot of ambiguity sometimes. And so the way we basically define it is like this. So it's a stretch of real language produced by a real speaker or writer for a real audience. Okay, and it's designed to convey a real message of some sort. Okay, so basically, it's not something that is made for a textbook or for language learners. Okay, so if it's made specifically for language learners, it's considered contrived and not authentic. So those types of materials are generally slower. They have the vocabulary is fixed so that it's easier to understand. They use speakers who so they use speakers with like very clear accents generally. So a more standard variety, whatever that means. You can debate that. And then so like any of that stuff, like when anything is done to that, when you adapt a text or a listening material in any way, you make it so it's no longer authentic, essentially. Okay, and so this offers a very good definition because it makes it possible so native speakers can easily identify it. So if you're a native speaking teacher, you can and you want to incorporate authentic materials in your lessons, then you can actually look for them and easily find them. You can determine pretty quickly what's authentic and what's not. It encompasses a large amounts of language variation. So this is one of the problems that we find. So authentic materials, it's easy to say like it's meant to focus on this like real language produced by a real speaker, meant for real audiences. But then when we get down and look at it closer, what's considered as real? So we have all of these different language varieties that we speak, especially in English. And so you have to think, okay, so are we going to include all of these in the umbrella of authenticity? We kind of have to. So then if we only take if we only look at a narrow variety, like a narrow window, like maybe only using one variety, like the standard that we generally try to use, it's not really authentic because you're not exposing the learners to other types. Okay. And then so different surface discourse features. So the way that we actually glue everything together and the way that we have conversations will be different. And let's see, what else is there? There is also so considering the English as a global language. So as I said, so English actually poses a pretty big problem for this idea of authenticity because we're not. It's owned by a lot of different cultural groups, so you can't really locate it within one culture. So we looked at this as a problem with the idea of integratedness. So the same thing kind of happens with authenticity. So which culture are we aiming to be a part of? Should we be showing people or having people listen to language varieties from India, or should we be sticking only to North American? Should we include the British? There's a problem there in that. And I think sometimes there's this misconception that authentic is automatically good, and it's not necessarily. It's not always going to be a good thing to use. Okay, so we need to remember as teachers that the more contrived materials also have a specific use to them. They actually are really good for focusing learner attention to form, for practice, to kind of wet their feet a little bit before they get into these more difficult materials that we can eventually show them. Okay, so how does all this relate to motivation? So we see a lot of claims among teachers. I also do this, and I think it's just something that we kind of start. It makes sense to most of us, and so we kind of just assume it's there. And the claims are so the more interesting. So authentic materials are more interesting than contrived materials. So you're kind of, by including them, you're actually making it so that they're intrinsically interesting to the learner. So they actually have this interest in them, and because they can actually apply it outside of the classroom, they can actually see a purpose for it. Okay, which I mean is probably true in some respects. But as you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's not really a lot of research that's actually tested those claims. It's kind of all hearsay at this point. And then also, so showing learners that they can cope with text is motivating. Okay, so by giving them these more difficult texts and allowing them to like work with them and seeing that they can actually successfully complete a task with them, it shows them that they can actually be successful in the real world. So the texts themselves become a motivating thing. So they're the result. So they actually make it so that motivation is the result of the authentic materials rather than the cause of using them. Okay, so that's actually, so I mean, that's kind of interesting to see there. So some people make this argument that like, oh well, motivation is that caused by using these authentic materials. And it's kind of difficult to see. It's kind of difficult to determine. So which direction is it going? So you could say that students are already motivated to actually start using authentic materials. So I mean, that's difficult. And yeah, so I mean, these are some of the claims that people make to kind of promote the use of authentic materials in the classroom. There are counterclaims though. So as you can see, so difficulties associated with the text demotivate learners. So on the other hand, so people are like, oh well, these texts are difficult, but people can, if they can cope with them, it's motivating. But on the other hand, you have people saying, well, sometimes, well, if the difficulties that come with these texts are actually so difficult that they actually cause the learners to think that they can't succeed. So it actually demotivates them. Okay, so you kind of see people borrowing things from like attribution theory or self-efficacy theory here to explain how authenticity is actually influencing motivation. The problem is there's not a strong research basis for making either claim, and so right now everybody, like, your best guess is as good as mine in terms of like what's going on here. Okay. Yeah, so there's difficulty with establishing causal connection between authenticity and motivation. So yeah, so like we said, there's a lack of clear definition, so it's very ambiguous. Even materials that we think would be good authentic materials, so like TV broadcasts or radio broadcasts, those are still scripted. So in a sense, they're still not quite authentic. So the true authentic materials would be conversations. So listening conversations. And Gilmore makes a good point here that even if you did present them with authentic conversations, they're not going to be interesting on their own. So the interesting thing about conversations is actually being able to be a part of the conversations, not just listening to them. So if you just have students like listen to them, they're not really establishing, there's not really an aim per se for using those materials. And like the main aim is to establish communicative competence. Okay. And then yeah, so how effective authentic materials are depends on how appropriate they are for students, how they're used, and how effective the teacher is. So I mean, so authentic materials are a start, but there's a lot of other factors that come into play here. So these can actually all have an effect on motivation too. So yeah, so if they're not appropriate for the students, they're too easy or too hard, that's going to affect them. That's going to make it so that they're going to be demotivating. How they're used. So if they're not used effectively, students won't really maintain interest in them. So once again, motivation will be maintained. And then if the teacher is not effective, so if they're just kind of like throwing them at the students, and not really scaffolding them or anything like that, then it's going to make it more difficult. And so learners won't necessarily see themselves as being capable. Okay. So when we look at the students in particular, I mean, we can see that, so we find some research that suggests that certain learner characteristics make authentic materials actually really useful in the classroom. So learners' goals will determine the success of the authentic materials. Okay, so whatever their goal is going to determine whether or not those authentic materials are worthwhile. Okay, so and based on their goals, different authentic materials will be better than others. Okay, So in general, yeah. So higher integrative orientations will have a more positive reaction to authentic materials. So if they actually want to be part of that community, they're going to be more open to using those authentic materials. If they're just taking this class to fulfill a requirement, they don't care either way. So those materials won't really make a difference. If they have some sort of purpose, though, like being able to identify more with the community, or for maybe living abroad, or getting a promotion for a job, or working abroad. So depending on the authentic materials, those goals will lead to so depending on the goals, they will have a differing effects on the authentic materials, and different materials will be better for achieving each goal. Okay, and another thing, so familiarity with materials also matters. So if students are not familiar at all with the materials, or if they're not really used to using authentic materials, it's going to have like a slowing effect on their progress, kind of. So they'll be really slow to be able to use those materials, and so it actually might frustrate them more than anything. So you want to make sure that you scaffold them, so you build up to them. So generally what we suggest is trying to use like a starting off with more contrived materials that focus on very specific aspects that you're looking at, and then kind of loosening the reins a little bit from there. So getting to more and more advanced materials, which just makes sense, because you don't want to just with language, it's not really a sink or swim kind of deal. Generally, you want to build up to something. People do function well with sink or swim, but not everybody. And most people will function better if they have some sort of foundation to build off of. Yeah. So then this kind of leads into the idea of like student and teacher perceptions. So basically what happens here is, so how do students perceive materials and methodologies that teachers are using? Okay, so we talked about how authentic materials can work or not work. Unfortunately, there's not really much of a conclusion there. I would say still that, like, with authentic materials, so just going back, it's good to try and incorporate them into your class somewhat. Especially depending on the languages. I've done a study where I find that learners based in more like French, German, and Spanish tend to actually be there more for the requirement fulfilling aspect than people who are in other languages like Chinese or Japanese or Arabic. And that's because generally they're perceived as easier, even though that's not the case. So if you're going to use authentic materials, you should still try to incorporate them in all of those classes, but just understand that, so depending on the language that you're teaching, they'll be perceived differently by students. Okay, so if your students are in a class that's more likely to have an instrumental motivation focus for fulfilling just a language requirement for the university or for high school even, they're not going to be as into those materials. Okay, so you'll have to deal with that a little bit more. Okay. So then going back to perceptions then, so students and teachers, there's been a lot of studies that look at their perceptions, and so they actually tend to have differing perceptions of what's going on in the classroom. Okay, so while teachers might view this one thing as being really good and innovative, students might not really see it in that way. Okay. And so what we have here is the idea. So like perceptions actually influence students' abilities to derive happiness and pleasure from learning. So if they actually perceive something as not worthwhile, or as kind of boring or whatnot, or not as positively as teachers perceive it, then they're not going to really like it that much. So that takes the intrinsic interest out of it. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit more demotivating. So perceptions are really important here. And I think it's important to remember that as a teacher, even though you are perceiving something as really helpful and great, if the students don't understand it, it's not going to be worthwhile. I'll get to that at the end. And so Burnhouse and Gardner, they kind of look at all this. And so what they do is they seek to investigate how students and teachers perceive strategies, okay? So they want to see how the students and teachers either are similar or different, and they seek to look at the relationship between teachers and students' perceptions and student achievement motivation. I'm not going to go through all the results. There's so many there, and I think going through all of it would just confuse you, so I will just give you a brief overview of the conclusions at the end. But just to review a little bit, so so they look at an English exam to determine their achievement, and then the scales for motivation they looked at. So they looked at integrativeness, of course, because it's Gardner, and then so attitude towards the learning situation, motivation in general. So this is probably something like intended effort into a task, and then language anxiety, instrumental orientation, and then the parental encouragement. Okay. So when we look at their general conclusions, they kind of see, so teachers differ in the frequency of the different types of methods. So they looked at the difference between like innovative versus traditional methods. So teachers differed in how much they use those, but they had more of a leaning towards traditional methods for teaching. Okay. And so even when teachers use these different methods and they thought they were using them, students did not always recognize the difference. Okay, so group work was not always seen as something that was like innovative and communicative by the students. So students were more aware of traditional strategies. Okay, and so in general, the perceptions that students and teachers had were related to learner achievement and motivation in some way. Okay, so I mean, it was pretty much a straightforward study. They found exactly what you would expect them to find based on what we've been talking about in the past weeks and in theory and everything. So it wasn't like groundbreaking or anything. But I think the take-home message from the study was this. Okay, so this is what they give, and I have an additional thing to say too. So students will not always appreciate strategies because of the lack of interest in the subject matter. They also may not be familiar with those other strategies, so they might not see it. So they might not really see the difference because of that. So it's kind of difficult to gauge unless you actually instruct them in the different types of strategies that are available. So they give 2 suggestions. So use whatever strategies you're comfortable with. So this is obvious as a teacher. If you use something you're not comfortable with, it's not going to result in a very good result. It's not going to have a very good outcome. Okay, so if you're uncomfortable, then you're not going to be as effective as you could potentially be. The key thing is to make sure they're of value of students and that students actually perceive them as valuable. Okay, so you need to actually check your students' perceptions, and you need to remember that other factors play an important role in motivation and achievement. Okay, so you don't want to focus just on your teaching methods or strategies. You want to remember that there are things out there that are beyond you that factor those, and so you won't be able to get everybody to be on board with what you're doing. Another thing that I think really helps that I don't have on here is to communicate with your students as to what the strategies you're using are and why they're important. It helps students to see the purpose. And if they can see the purpose, they can actually perceive it as valuable for themselves. Okay, and so that's actually going to help with their motivation in general. Okay, so that actually goes back to authentic materials too. So when you introduce an authentic material for the first time, students are going to think it's really difficult. And you want to make sure they understand that that difficulty is important for pushing themselves forward. Okay, so we've been talking about this idea of like students taking control of their learning and autonomy and whatnot. So if you give them these tools kind of to see why this is important, especially with authenticity, because there's authentic materials all over the place that they can look for. They can actually learn that these authentic materials are useful for them. in their language development, they can actually see language use being used in its natural setting, and so that's actually going to promote better results in their proficiency attainment later on. So they'll be able to use it in a more real way. And so they can actually take more control of their learning in that sense. They can actually seek out these new materials and challenge themselves more. So in a way, I would say that authenticity does promote motivation, but maybe not in the ways that we generally think of it. Okay. Yeah, so that's the end of my lecture for the week. You have also you have to watch group number 3. So group number 3 has their presentation up now, and so make sure to participate in the discussion forum based on that. Also for next week, we have the so you'll be reading something by Papi again, so Papi and Abdulazda. So that's yeah, so 2012. That's supposed to say Magid. I think autocorrect fixed that for me. So Magid and Chan, 2012, and then Guyoto and Dernier, 2008. So those are the 3 articles for next week. And then the discussion post in the presentation. Okay, so yeah, and then just a note for feedback. So I have your reading quizzes, so I will be working on those over the next couple of days. So you should expect to get those back by the end of the weekend. And then your proposals, I will be looking at those over the course of the next week. So you'll be getting them back gradually as I give you feedback. So be sure to check for those periodically. And if you have any questions about my feedback, feel free to email me or set up a time to meet with me on Skype. Either one will work. Okay. Other than that, that's it for today, and I'll be back next week.